Well, welcome once again to our series, What About? Week 3 of our series, What About? Where we wrestle with your questions. My name's Dion, but we're gonna get to your questions because I know you have questions. And the reason I know you have questions is because we asked you what your questions were and you asked a ton of questions. Back in January, we asked you, and we used your questions to build this series, and here are some of the things you said back then. You asked, how can you explain God's goodness in the midst of so much suffering in the world? Or in these times of chaos, how do we know that God is in control? Why did God create man, someone asked. Life is full of hardships. Someone else said, I believe in God, so why do bad things happen to me? Someone else says, why does God allow evil to exist? Someone said, why does God let bad things happen in our world? And then someone said, why do bad things happen to good people? And someone else said, why do bad things happen to good people? And someone else said, why do bad things happen to good people? And that happened like 20 more times. I won't read each one of those for you. And here's what's amazing to me. All of those questions were asked back in January before we were dealing with this full-blown coronavirus pandemic that we've been dealing with now. And so, as we look around at this crazy world, especially now, it's only natural for us to ask the question that we're asking today. What is God up to? What are God's intentions? What is God doing in this crazy world? And right now, if you have a question about God's intentions, or if you wonder what he's up to really in this crazy world, you can text those questions into the number on the screen right now, and I'm gonna answer those for you in just another minute. Again, I should say, especially if you're watching live right now at 9 o'clock, otherwise you'll have to wait until Tuesday for those to be answered. Now, here's the thing. In my experience in life, if I ever encounter a whole family full of dysfunctional children, it's only normal and it's only a matter of time before you start to wonder, whole family full of dysfunctional children, you start to wonder, what's going on with the parents, right? And by the same token, when you look around at a very dysfunctional world filled with chaos and brokenness, it is only a matter of time before you start to ask the question, what on earth is going on with the one who made all of this, the Father, the creator of all of this? And when you start to ask that question, which is a very reasonable question, by the way, when you start to ask that question, different portraits emerge. I'm gonna share several of them with you. The first portrait that emerges is what I'll call the absent father portrait. You probably know the drill with this one. The father who brought you into this world, or at least had something to do with bringing you into this world, but then someday went out for a pack of cigarettes and never came back. And you know what's true is that a lot of people, especially really intelligent people, tend to buy into this view of God when they look around at the world. See, they look around at the world and they see everything that is so spectacular and amazing and wonderful. They see the power and the complexity at work in creation. And they say, hey, there's no way this could just get here like this. Someone must have made it. There must be a creator. But then they also look around at the brokenness of the world and the chaos and the dysfunction of the world, and they say, well, whoever made this, they must not be around anymore. They gone, right? Absent father. And I think part of what fuels this view of God is not just the evidence we see around in the world, but I think what fuels this view of God is our own experience, our own human experience with fatherlessness. The other day, I was listening to the radio, listening to Spotify, and the Kelly Clarkson song came on, Piece by Piece. How many of you know that song? Yeah, hopefully a lot of you do. It's a really powerful song, and I remember the first time I heard that song, I just remember crying. I ain't too proud to say it. I ended up just crying with her, and she was actually crying as she got through the end of the song, talking about her own experience with her father and feeling abandoned. And actually, my favorite version of that song is a version that my own daughter Ellie sang about 3 or 4 years ago. Someone for a birthday gift got her a chance to record some songs, and she recorded that song. And it was right when her voice was still kind of younger. And when she sings that song, I think I'm a pretty good dad, and I think Ellie and I have a good relationship. But there's something in her voice when she sings that song that makes me wonder if that's not true, if she knows some pain in our relationship, because I love how she sings that song. But the other day, I heard this song again, and I didn't cry, but here's what I did. I grabbed my phone and I texted my dad, and I just said, hey, I know it must not have always been easy, but thanks for staying. And in some sense, it seems crazy that you'd have to thank a dad for staying. That's what you're supposed to do, right? In the words of Chris Rock. And yet, the reality is that it must not be an easy thing to do, because this is a story that we know. And it's because of the abandonment that we kind of know of, because we know what it is to be forgotten by a parent, that I think this becomes such a compelling portrait we have of God when we look around at the world. Maybe he was here once, but he must not be here anymore. The next portrait's a lot like it. It's a portrait that I call the checked out dad. He's not a bad guy. He's just not very aware, or he's not very attentive, or maybe he's not that smart, or maybe he's just not that interested in you. He's got more interesting things going on. And I know this is sometimes people's view of God too, that maybe he's up there, but he's just not paying attention to whatever is going on down here. Or this next portrait, this is what I call your mom's no good boyfriend portrait. Now this guy is not your dad, but he's the only man that you have around. And although he likes your mom, he just puts up with you. And the reality is that both you and your mom are in the same position when it comes to this guy, that this guy is no good. I mean, this guy, he makes you feel so small, he makes you feel so worthless that you don't even entertain leaving. He grinds you down to such a fine powder that although you don't really like having him around, you feel kind of grateful that he's there. You feel afraid of what would happen to you if he left. See, you don't like this guy, but you feel like you need him, and it's a very dysfunctional thing. And here's what I'll say, those first two portraits maybe don't connect with a lot of Christians in our view of God, but in a twisted way, I think a lot of us see God in this way, especially in moments like right now. Because sometimes the things that I hear Christians saying make it sound a lot like God is putting us through all of this to break us, to drive us to our knees in kind of this dominating, abusive, unhealthy way so that we'll appreciate him. And of course, that couldn't be further from the truth, and yet this is a picture that we have. And then finally, in the interest of being gender equal, we can talk about this final portrait. That is the portrait of the controlling mother. Now, she's a good mom. She's gonna take care of you. She's gonna fight for you as long as you do everything her way. And if you don't do it her way, there is hell to pay. And so you learn to tiptoe or to walk on eggshells, or maybe you secretly rebel, but you better be careful because you know that there are landmines everywhere around you if you happen to get off track or to do something that this parent doesn't want you to do. Now, maybe there are other portraits that you have, other images that you have. Those, in my experience, are the most common ones, just in talking to people. Pictures that we have of God, and maybe one of those actually resonates with your own picture. But I've got another picture for you. I've got a picture that I want to paint, a portrait that I want to paint, not in pictures, in images, but in words. In the words of Jesus, and I want to paint a picture, a portrait of a God, in spite of everything that you see going around you, a God who is indiscriminately good. Look at how Jesus describes him. Matthew 5, he says, "You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies, and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. And I just got to pause here for a second, because here's what Jesus is saying. He's telling us not only something about our Father, which we'll get to in a second, but he's also saying something to us. And I just have to use this opportunity to remind us, especially in times like these, that we are called to love our neighbors. We're called to love our enemies. And so even if your neighbor right now feels like your enemy, you're still called to love them. And right now, there's a lot of judgment going around against people who maybe aren't handling this thing the way that you want them to handle it, and maybe aren't following the rules the way that you want them to follow the rules. And there's a lot of judgment about how people are trying to survive this whole virus thing. And Jesus says here that, hey, we're called to love them. Not only that, he tells us something that when we love our neighbors, when we love our enemies, when we pray for those who persecute you, then we look like our Father. He's telling us something about our Father in heaven. That he's someone who always loves, indiscriminately, loves his friends, even loves his foes. And then Jesus goes on and he says this. He says, he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. And I love that Jesus here turns it to nature, to creation. He says, sun and rain, things that we all need to survive, especially back in the day that he was saying these words. God doesn't discriminate. He doesn't give it to the good people and not to the bad people. He is indiscriminately good. Now, creation is interesting to me because creation, no matter what's going on, creation tends to go on, and it's interdependent, it's beautiful, it's filled with splendor. It manifests the glory and the goodness of God all the time. Creation does. I've got an Instagram account, and if I don't follow you and you follow me, don't feel bad. I don't hardly follow anyone. I follow just a few family members and very close friends. Most of who I follow funny things. I follow some meme accounts that make me laugh, because I need to laugh more than ever. I follow a few personal growth accounts, and then I follow travel accounts. I follow accounts that put up pictures of places in the world that I have never heard of, or places that I've heard of but I've never thought to go. And every morning I wake up and I kind of look through those pictures of these stunningly beautiful places all over the world. And there are more than I can count. And here's what I'm amazed by. I'm amazed at how those beautiful places still exist, even when a virus is working its way through our world, or a tornado touches down in some location, or there's famines or other things. The created world is still stunning and beautiful, and it goes on undeterred, testifying to the goodness of God. And I know that it's hard to stay focused on those things when we're going through hard things, especially like we are right now. And that's all because of something in social science called fundamental attribution error. Fundamental attribution error. What this means is that we mistakenly, selectively piece through the data or the evidence that we see around us, and we mistakenly or selectively apply only certain things to the subject that we're studying. This happens all the time in racism. Right? If you have racist views about a people group, then you tend to watch the people group and you look for signs of the people group behaving in a way that supports your view. It's also called sometimes confirmation bias. And you tend to ignore everything else that might challenge your view. You kind of select and pick and choose, and then you decide what things you're gonna attribute to that person that you're studying, or that being that you're studying. And you know what? We do this all the time with God. We don't equally hold into account. We don't equally weigh everything that we see. We only pick and choose, especially the negative things, don't we? We love the negative things. Which is why when wildfires rip through California, 200,000 acres, we shake our fists at God and we say, God, where are you? How could you let this happen? While completely ignoring that, 200,000 acres, that's a lot. But there are 10 billion acres of forests on this planet that are just thriving. Or it's why when this virus is going on and it kills over 50,000 people in our country, we tend to get very upset with God and wonder what he's doing. And we completely ignore the fact that 85,000 people have already recovered. He's spared them and restored them. Not to mention nearly 330 million people in our country haven't had any issue with it at all. Fundamental attribution error is why when you're out of work, and this is hitting close to home for some of you, you've lost your job, you're so angry with God for not providing for you. But for the last decade, as you went to work, there was not a drop of gratitude in your heart or even recognition that your job was a gift from God. It's fundamental attribution error. And in another part of the Bible, a guy named James gets to this, how this fundamental attribution error gets in the way of how we see God. Here's what he says in the book of James. He says, "Who is wise and understanding among you?" And I know these days, I feel like I'm very wise. I'm reading the news and I'm like, everyone's an idiot. If they just did it my way, then, and maybe you're afflicted by this too. Who's wise and understanding among you? If you think you are, James says, then show it by your good life, by deeds done in humility that come from wisdom. And then he goes on, but if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom, so-called wisdom, does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic, he says. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder in every evil practice. Here's what James says. James says, so often we look around the world, and this is true right now, we even look at people who claim to be followers of God, and we see the dysfunction in their life, and here's what we do. We tend to upload that stuff onto God, and we say, oh, well, if this is what his followers look like, then this must be true of him. Or we look around at the world, and we see sickness and disease and warfare and fighting. And we say, oh, well, if this is the nature of the world, then that must be true of the one who made it. But it's a fundamental attribution error. James says really clearly, he says, hey, no, there's another source from that stuff. And if selfish ambition and bitter envy are your thing, the reality is that stuff doesn't come from above. That stuff is earthly, it's unspiritual, it's demonic, it's got a different origin. But on the flip side, here's what he says. Instead of uploading our baggage up to God, here's what he says. But the wisdom that comes down from heaven is first of all pure. Then it's peace-loving. It's considerate. It's submissive. It's full of mercy and good fruit. It's impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. In other words, if you want to look like our Father in heaven, instead of uploading our baggage on him, look at his goodness coming down and conform your life to that. See, James says something really important, that whenever we try to upload our baggage onto God, it's a mistake. It's a logical fallacy. Instead, James says, you've got to pay attention to what comes down. And not just what comes down, but you got to pay attention to who came down. Do you know why Jesus came into the world? He came into the world to set the record straight once and for all who God is and what he's like. And you can think whatever you want to about some mysterious God in heaven, but when you look at the person of Jesus, there's no doubt about who he is or what he's like or what he's all about. In Jesus, the record is so clear that he's all the things that James said. He's full of mercy, and he's peace-loving, and he's considerate, and he's even submissive. He's impartial and sincere. Jesus came into this world. No social distancing, wasn't afraid of our plague of violence and sin. He came into this world, and although he didn't get infected by it, he fell victim to it. He gave up his life in order to be an antidote that would bring healing and transformation to our lives. And whatever you think about God, the invisible God, you can't look at Jesus and have any doubt. You can't look at Jesus and think anything else other than this is someone who is indiscriminately good. See, you can't look around at the world and upload that to God and come up with one of these pictures. The only way to truly see God as he is, to know him as he is to look at what comes down, to look at who comes down. And yet, let me just say this quickly, that although God is a God who is indiscriminately good, and Jesus is the portrait that where we see all of that, here's the thing. God is no Santa Claus, and he's no, over-the-top grandparent who can't tell their grandkids no. He's not here to give you everything that you want. And so for us, that means that sometimes it seems like, we just want God to give us all good things, or at least how we define good things. But if he were to do that, if he were to give us everything that we want, it would leave us shallow and weak and fragile. In fact, you know people like that, don't you? You know people and you go, hey, he's not a bad guy. I've had people work for us like that. Not a bad guy, but he just needs to experience something hard so that he can grow, so that he can mature. See, more than short-term happiness, God is after your formation. He wants to make you wholehearted, fully integrated. And the School of Hard Knocks, that's his workshop. He uses hard things to form us. So yeah, you know what? God, a God who is indiscriminately good, he permits evil. And he never lets evil overrun us. It's always contained in small pockets, even during a pandemic, right? But our loving God knows that even evil, he can make work for our good. That's how good he is. And let me tell you, this has got to just irritate evil so much. Because here's what happens. Evil sweeps through the world, leaving a wake of destruction and chaos everywhere. And evil's patting itself on the back as it looks at all of this chaos, all of this death, all of this sadness, all of this warfare and violence and all the rest. And then here's what happens. Evil's going along, and then evil looks in its rear view mirror and sees God coming behind, picking up all of the pieces, sifting through the rubble, putting us in our world back together. He created, but putting it back together, putting us back together so much better than we were before. Sifting through the wreckage that evil makes in our world, that evil causes in our world, and piece by piece, lovingly, because he's indiscriminately good, putting things back together, making us more wholehearted, more full than we ever were before. Because he's a God who is indiscriminately good. That's all I'm gonna say for now, because I really wanna take your questions, and I know you have a lot of them. So on this subject, go ahead, if you haven't done so already, and text in your questions right now to the number on the screen.
Well, hey, thanks, Dion. Thanks for sharing that with us.
You're welcome.
You did a great job. We have no questions. You just covered everything. So
Brilliant.
yeah, actually, we have a lot of questions. And if you want to get yours in, you can text this number, 636-498-9282. So get those in quickly if you have any, and I will throw some up. So our first question, I thought it was a great question. You talked a lot about different ways of viewing God. This person says, I know there are things that God cares deeply about and probably some that he doesn't. So to what level of detail does God actually invest in people's lives?
To what level of detail does God actually invest in people's lives?
Yeah.
I think there's probably, and I'm not exactly sure what the concern is in this question. I can say this, that God is deeply concerned and cares about every aspect of our lives.
Okay.
But God is not, I think to that controlling mother image, God is not like hyper controlling about everything. So I think it's hard for us when we say, does God care about every aspect of my life, to imagine or to think about that in a way that it's not like God is seeking to control every part of my life or micromanaging or that everything is super high stakes. So while there are some things in life that we do that matter more than others, God cares about it all. And he would love to help us and direct us in all of it, but we shouldn't feel paralyzed. We shouldn't feel and I know a lot of Christians feel this way, that we're really afraid of kind of making a misstep because God will be disappointed or that's gonna wreck everything.
Yeah.
And so we live under grace. God is good, as I said. Even when evil is having its worst, God is putting the pieces back together in a glorious way. Yeah, that's all I'll say.
Awesome, thank you. Next question.
I'm trying to keep these short because I'm not good.
We have to. Yeah, we got to get a lot of
short answers.
If God can do anything, why didn't he create a universe with only good?
It's a great question. If God can do anything, why not create a universe with only good? In the beginning, he did create a universe with only good, but he also created a universe where there was free will, where there's a potential for people to do bad. And that's kind of this thing that's implicit in what we have. To truly love someone, you have to have the freedom not to love someone. And so again, I think these images of control can become really problematic as we think about God. God is not out to control every aspect of our lives. And if he wanted robots, he could have made robots, and that would have been a guarantee that the whole world was good.
Yeah.
But instead, God opted for something else. He opted for free will, for volition, for the chance to have relationship, and that's always a risky endeavor. I am a parent, and I realize that even though I can't fully control my kids, that if I work really hard to try to control them, I could probably mitigate against a lot of problems if I just controlled every aspect of their life. Instead, I opt for something better. I opt for relationship, I opt for growth, which means that maybe my kids are gonna make more mistakes in the near term, but over the long term, it's gonna be for their formation. And so yeah, God did make a perfect world, but he also made a world where we've got freedom.
Okay, so continuing on this idea of this world we're living in, this person just simply says, how is addiction part of God's plan?
How is addiction?
How is addiction part of God's plan?
Yeah, again, this idea that everything that happens is a part of God's active plan is not, it's not part of God's plan. That's not how it works. Just because it is doesn't mean that it is exactly as God wants. So I talk about this idea a lot, that I think redemption is one of the most powerful truths in the scriptures. And I think redemption is kind of this other side of a God who's just controlling everything and he's planning for everything. Redemption means God buys things back, and it's kind of the slavery term. You redeem a slave, or in Michigan, we have 10-cent bottle refund.
Nice.
So it's a redemption thing. So you bring back the bottle or the can and you get 10 cents back. You're buying that thing back. But God's true power is shown in his ability to redeem anything that happens, to allow things to happen, to not control everything, but to kind of claim to pick up the pieces, to claim that stuff and to make something of it, to claim it as his own and to fix it. And so God allows a lot of things to happen in the world. It's not part of his active plan for us. God doesn't want to see people addicted. And that's why he gives us so much counsel in the scriptures that warn us against overindulging in anything, whether it's food or alcohol or sex or anything. Addiction's not a part of God's plan. And yet God permits us to kind of live our lives. And here's what God can do. And my own father-in-law is a recovering alcoholic. And I know a lot of people see how God then moves later on, how he redeems their addiction for deeper growth. And I know that's not happening for everybody. And it sounds like, someone who's asking this question, you have a loved one who probably is in the throes of this. And I know how painful that is. But here's what I just tell you, that's not beyond God's ability to redeem. And whether or not God overwhelms that person in your life and forces them to stop being an addict, I don't think that's how God works. But here's what I can say, that God is with you and he's active still in this situation. He's loving you and he's good, even while he allows us to go our own way.
Thank you. And this is a question that is one that I think a lot of people are struggling with right now. It's kind of a, where do I go? It just says, what does God want from us? Do I push to work now and provide for my family and risk their safety with the virus? Or do I put safety first and not risk anything and risk kind of being a good provider? So it's kind of a long question, but yeah, you kind of feel that tension.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, what does God want? Man, this is rough because for me, I have an answer for this question, and I'm not sure that it's meant to be a universal answer for everybody. I know what God has said to me during this time, or how God has directed me, and God has really given me a sense of peace about being at risk or vulnerable. I'm being as smart as I can, but I believe my life needs to go on. I need to continue to have purpose. It's kind of weird because what I do here, I think, is unique, maybe in some ways, and
very much.
And it's needed right now in the world. So I go to work. I put myself, at risk in small ways, and I feel very much like, hey, God's encouraged me to do that. I think we're not all the same. Mm-hmm. I think right now in this situation, the work that we have to do is not all the same. The calling that we have is not all the same. And so I think wrestling with God with those questions is important. But I also think right now there is a baseline principle here that our lives are in God's hands. Yeah. And we shouldn't be reckless. Jesus says, don't put the Lord your God to the test when the devil tempts him to throw himself off a cliff. He's like, hey, we're not out here to be foolish and to tempt God. But at the same time, our lives are in God's hands. Yeah. And for me, that just gives me a lot of comfort to know that when I'm not just being a foolish, reckless, risky guy, but I'm trying to do what I feel like God has called me to do. In the end, it's in God's hands. And if I get sick, God will be with me. And if God wants to keep me well, he'll keep me well. And I'm just gonna do what I know to do, or what I believe God is calling me to do. And I'm not gonna worry too much about the outcome, which, as I said, is one of the things that's making me a little crazy right now, is how much judgment there is toward other people. You don't know, John, what God has called me to do, and I don't know what God's calling you to do right now. We all just have to do what we think God's calling us to do and trust him to be good.
Well, to that point, there was a question about a Bible verse that we talk about. Jeremiah 29:11 says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord." How should we interpret that? How do we interact with what God's plans are for our life?
Yeah, those words from Jeremiah, they come especially at a time when Israel's about to experience hard things. So the irony of that is, I prosper you, not to harm you, give you a hope and a future, but right in your near doorstep, you're gonna be carried off into exile. There's gonna be warfare. It's gonna be ugly. You're gonna be decimated as a nation for a while. So it's a long-term promise, when in fact the reality of their near-term situation is gonna be pretty bleak. And those words are served as a reminder that even when our near-term reality is bleak, God has a long-term plan to grow us. And true to what we talked about today, even in the short-term pain, so prospering, we're talking about ultimate harm, but I'm come to prosper you, to give you a hope and a future. To have a future, that means sometimes experiencing hard things. That means being formed by hard things. And that's how God gives us a really rich future. It's not just through giving us easy things, but even as we're facing the hard things, as they were when Jeremiah wrote those words and God inspired him to do it, there was this near-term ugliness that was actually going to take Israel to a place where they would be more long-term blessed. I'll just say this, and this is kind of maybe a little bit too deep into history, but Israel kept struggling with idolatry, like worshiping false gods and doing it in really ugly ways, until the exile. So this ugly thing that happens to them, people are going, God has forgotten us. How can God forget us? How can he do this to his people? It actually became the thing that pretty much kicked out gross idolatry from Israel. After they returned from exile, they no longer had an idolatry problem. They weren't worshiping other gods anymore. They had other problems,
Yeah.
but that problem was
Plenty of
taken
other
away with. And so even through that, God did prosper them.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that's hard for us to understand, how God prospers us through suffering and hard times.
Yeah, I think this is a question that kind of flips it to the other side. So we are experiencing hard times. There's some very obvious things out there that are direct evils. So on the flip side of that, a lot of people are wanting God to just clear it all up.
Yeah.
So this person just really says, does God make miracles today like he did in the Bible?
Yes. Next question. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah,
Right.
yeah. I mean, he absolutely does. But I have prayed. You know, when this thing first started, I prayed. Why not? You know, I prayed, God, miraculously shield us. You know, shield our country. Shield St. Louis. Shield Pathfinder Church. You know, do whatever you want. God, make your name great by doing a miraculous thing. Just hold back the virus, and that'll be a testimony to your goodness. I ask for miracles all the time. And then I also realized that maybe my idea of a miracle isn't actually the best idea. And so I try to submit that over to God. But I pray for miracles and I hold them very loosely. And I just say, God, but you do whatever you want. And if you've got a greater purpose in all of this, if there's something else you want to do, if you can write a better ending than this. I mean, yeah, if I were watching Jesus go to the cross as one of his followers, I would have been praying for a miracle. God, spare him, save him from this. And by doing so, we would have missed a greater miracle of what God did by letting him die and rising him again from the grave and writing a better ending. So I always hold those miracles requests loosely, but I still make them.
For our last question, I just wanted to, this is more of a personal question, and I can kind of hear the pain in it. What is God trying to teach me by allowing my mother to die in a hospital while I'm on my way there? So while I'm still on the plane. So this is someone who's experienced a very specific trauma.
Yeah, and to whoever asked that question, I'm so sorry that, you know, we talk about this virus as just kind of a thing. You know, it's just a thing that's floating out there in the world. You're dealing with this, and I don't know if this is virus related or something else, but you're dealing with loss in a very personal way. And I just say, I'm sorry. One of the things I do want you to know is at the very beginning of your question, when you say, what is God trying to teach me? I don't know that God is trying to teach you anything from, you know, that sounds a little punitive to me, and maybe that's not how you mean it, but you know, like God's trying to teach me a hard lesson here.
Yeah.
Things happen in this world. Evil is still at work. As James says, the things that happen that are hard, that are ugly, those do not come from above. They are earthly, they're unspiritual, they are demonic. And there is evil that is at work. God permits that stuff to happen. He does not cause all of it. So to assume that every hard thing that happens is God trying to teach us a lesson through the, you know, like that's not true. That's not necessarily true. But here's what I can promise that God is doing even in that very, very hard situation. And I think about this right now of people who are in hospitals and they don't have family around them, and people who love people who are in hospitals and you can't really go and see them. And I just think, man, that is so, so hard. Here's what I can say, that God is present. So he's present with your mother while she was dying in the hospital. He's present with you on the plane. He's present with your loved ones in the hospital. He's present with you. And he is there to love you and to see you through these hard moments without a doubt. And if there's anything that God is teaching, again, he's not teaching a hard punishing lesson through this thing. If there's anything that God is teaching, it is really that he can hold you through the hardest things. And the things that we think will break us and often break many, God is there to carry us through. It's like that old poem, and I know it's been made fun of, and it's a little cheesy, but that Footsteps poem. You know, I see footprints on a beach, and there's two sets, and then I see this as my journey with God, and then I see some places where there's only one set of footprints, and I'm like, God, where were you? You abandoned me, and God says back, no, those are the moments where I carried you. Those were the moments where I was actually seeing you through something really hard that would break you. I was carrying you through that. Yeah. So I think one of the things that God teaches us or allows us to learn in these moments is really how profoundly powerful his presence can be, and how deep his love is, and how tender his care is. And I know that's something that we don't all know how to access necessarily, but simply sometimes in those hardest moments when you're alone and separated, just asking God to give you his presence and to give you signs of his presence and to remind you that you're not alone, that can be a powerful growth thing that happens through something that maybe God never intended, and it's, part of evil's work in the world, but it's something that God redeems out of that ugliness, and you get to have that the rest of your life. Yeah. That you're never alone. I say it all the time, God is with you and he's for you and he loves you. And to know what that really means, that God is with me right now and he is always for me and he always loves me. And to be able to access that kind of presence is really a powerful thing. And so for anyone who's going through a hard time like this right now, if you're watching this from a hospital, if you love someone who you can't get to right now, just maybe use this as an opportunity to acknowledge that God is with you and to ask him to really help you understand what that means. Because when you experience the presence of God in those moments, it's a profound gift and it's actually a pretty life-changing thing.
Thanks for answering those questions. Thanks for the message. Thanks for fielding these questions. They're all over the place. I think people are feeling lots of different things in this time right now. So just to say this to you all, there was a lot more questions, and we have this podcast, Pathfinder Unscripted, on Tuesdays. Tune into that, and you can hear more questions answered. You can ask more questions, because that's what we're here for. We want to be here for you and help you through these times. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and I just, especially with that last question, I feel like giving an answer is probably the wrong thing to do. I think I'm trying my best to give an answer, but I feel like there are a lot of people who need prayer right now. And for all of you who ask questions who maybe have an unanswered question that you feel disappointed about, again, tune in Tuesday, we'll try to get to those. But I want to pray.
That's it.
Father in heaven, remind us in these moments that you are what your word says. You are who your son reveals you to be, that you are indiscriminately good. And God, as we face things that really make us question that, as we begin to wonder, as we face hard things where we're not sure, God, I pray that you would press in on us with your goodness, that you would manifest your presence to us in very real ways so that we can sense that you're with us, that you're for us, and you love us. And God, I pray that right now, especially those of us who are really afraid, who are really sad, who are really grieving, who are suffering in some way, God, I pray that one of the ways that you would redeem this, and I don't want to limit you, God, redeem it however you want, but I pray that one of the ways that you would redeem this moment is that you would teach us how good it is and how true it is that you're with us and you love us, and you just teach us how to abide in your presence and to receive the consolation of your spirit moment by moment. God, I certainly pray for that person who talked about being on a plane. I pray that for everyone who has a question. I pray that for those of us who are sitting on a question right now that is just eating away at our soul, and we want an answer, and maybe we got our question answered and it still isn't a satisfactory answer, or maybe our question hasn't been answered yet. God, as we wait on you for answers, and maybe those answers will never come, I pray that you would just press in on us with your goodness, your kindness, and your presence in such a powerful way that some of our questions would melt away in the light of your love and in the light of your goodness. I pray this in Jesus' mighty name. Amen.